Historic breakthrough. Aussies land a massive blow against the money power. And foreign agents in Parliament pushing Australia towards total destruction. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 29th of August 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
Craig, today is history making.
It surely is.
And wait till we get into it. But anyway, we're going to discuss the breaking news that the government is now looking at starting a postal bank. Yes, you heard that correctly. We want to get to that as quickly as we can. But also the second item today we're going to talk about the most blatant act of foreign interference in Australia's parliament you'll ever see, except it's not called that. So let's get into it. But remember, first, as we always say, this is not just for information, this is to actually activate and change Australia. And today's episode is all going to be about the proof of that it works. So your role in that is to help us to get the message out. And you can do that by liking the show, sharing it as widely as you can, especially this episode. Subscribe if you're not a subscriber and ring the bell icon so you can get notified of updates. Comment below. We want your feedback. We really value it. I try and respond as much as I can. So please comment below. And there's also below is a donate button where you can help support the work of the Citizens Party. And today is all going to be about that coming to fruition as well. And at the moment, one of the things we're doing is holding seminars around Australia. Craig, you're about to leave for the latest one in Launceston.
Yes, that's the 11th, Robbie. So we've done 11 of these now. They're very successful in allowing people to hear firsthand who we are, what we represent, and where we intend to go.
You don't want to row your boat.
No.
So you want
we need donations. Yeah, we do. I mean, it'll be a windy flight over there apparently this weekend. But we've got another one coming up in South Australia on the 15th of September. If you want to participate in that, you need to register. Just give us a call on the 1-800 number, which hopefully will be below, and you can register. You're welcome to come. You'll hear about where we stand in the world, because we never ever have these forums without positioning ourselves in the latest strategic updates, international updates. You'll hear from Nolene, who's going to present ideas of how people have been twisted to think in certain ways about and accept the sort of crap that we've put up with for the last 70 years. You're going to be giving a strategic update on where we stand. It's always breaking developments. I mean, the ones we did back in April to no, completely different to the ones we're doing now.
Exactly.
And then I give a history for people of where we've come from, how we started in the last 36 years. And our main principal focus has been the establishment of a national bank and fighting neoliberalism.
Yep.
And people have to understand, we'll get a sense of what this neoliberalism is and how we can return government to the people, which is going to be the subject of a national conference and our policy platform launch on the 17th of November. Now that's going to be live streamed on the on YouTube, and it's people are welcome to participate in person. Again, more details will come to light as we get into that. And that'll be like the culmination of all the 12 different forums. Our policy platform is centred around two things. One, the whole concept of pushing for a public post office bank, and then the second is about our national sovereignty, both of which are covered actually in the show today.
That's what this show's all about. I'll tell you people, if there's ever a time to jump on a bandwagon, this is it. So if you're in a position to get to Launceston, or probably a bit late for Launceston or South Australia, please do make sure you get yourself there and get involved, because we're about to show you that relentless effort can shape policy in this country. All right, let's get into it. Historic breakthrough. Aussies land a massive blow against the money power. And the reason we put it that way, Craig, is because we've been pushing for a policy that has really only one opponent, and that is the banking apparatus, which is not just banks running businesses, it is an apparatus. It's what the old Labor Party called the money power. It is the power in an economy. That's where it starts. Everything else is a subsidiary power. Literally everything, including military power, serves the military-industrial complex people talk about, serve an economic empire, right? It starts there. You either have a system where elected representatives of the people get to decide how a country is run, or you have a private banker's dictatorship. And the Anglo-American system is one where Wall Street and London rule, and that's what's happened. That's how Australia works as well, thanks to neoliberalism. And we've been at war with that. This party's been at war with that. And so the breakthrough is that, and regular viewers will appreciate this, and if you're a first-time viewer, you've got to understand our party has for 4 years been campaigning for a government bank operating through post offices. And what does the Australian newspaper say today? Post bank back on Labor agenda. A government-owned bank created out of Australia Post is understood to be back on the agenda 5 years after Labor leader Bill Shorten indicated it would be on the party's to-do list if elected. The understanding is that top executives are assisting the Albanese-led government with a plan to assess the move and how this would work in what is seen as a response to the closure of numerous bank branches in regional Australia. So we don't know more than that. I'll tell you what we do know, but just as a first pass, Craig, that formulation there means we, the Australian Citizens Party, and the viewers who've worked with us, and the other organisations who've worked with us, such as the Licensed Post Office Group, have just had an enormous victory. We have achieved a breakthrough that at times felt like it would never happen because we're up against the banks, right? The most powerful lobby in the country.
Yep.
We've worked on this relentlessly the postal bank concept we've worked on relentlessly for 4 years. A public bank we've campaigned for relentlessly for 28 years since Keating privatised Costello did the final privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank. And a national bank has been the hallmark of our party from the very beginning back at 36 years ago.
That's right.
Right? And this is the first step back in that direction, and you've heard it here first.
This is an important intervention in the current political system. I'm beginning to believe that the powers behind the scenes want the more fascist Peter Dutton to come back into power as a Liberal government at sometime next year. So you see all these operations. Now I don't know whether Albanese is just plain stupid or whatever, but he's pissed off the Palestinians and the Muslim community. He's pissed off the Chinese with the attacks on China that can continue to go on, although not as bad as under Dutton. And now he's pissed off the entire trade union movement. I mean, this is the Labor's main constituency. So who is wanting Labor out? And the key here is that if Labor then goes for a postal bank and actually starts to return to policies for the ordinary people, then he's got a real chance of at least stemming some of this crap and coming and staying in government. Because right now, Robbie, I think he's gone.
Well,
look at the Northern Territory and look at possibly what'll happen in Queensland.
Exactly. I speak to a Labor insider who is a big supporter of this concept, and this person said to me that they're saying to the Albanese government, give the people what you want. And what we've seen from Albanese for 3 years is cowardice. He's so afraid of his own shadow, and giving the opposition something to criticise. He hasn't delivered for what people voted him in to do, right? Except, as it turns out, on one thing, which we gave him credit for, which was Julian Assange. But even then, he did it in a way that enraged people right up until the last moment, right? There's no good being so obsequious to the Americans that you're not going to actually be honest about that you are being demanding of them. But anyway, so he did that. But in everything else, he ends up enraging both sides because you never appease the opposition. They're going to still attack you, and he ends up upsetting the people that he should be delivering for. And here's one policy that the Liberals are owned by the banks, Craig, except for one senator, and we're going to talk about him in a minute, who jumped ship. The Liberals are owned lock, stock and barrel. The banks started that party.
They're created by Menzies, right? And the problem you've got here is the banks are part of the global financial dictatorship you mentioned earlier. And therefore what we're going to start to see is if Dutton and these guys come back, there's got to be no restraint on the banks at all.
Yep.
There never has been. And the only way that you can deal with the current economic circumstances of this country, the only way that you can actually arrest things is to start to turn back neoliberalism. And this is the cutting edge is a public post office bank is the beginning of turning back this descent into neoliberalism we're seeing, the privatisation, economic rationalism, and the fact that people have to work 3 jobs to even begin to afford a house these days is all part of the problems. Also, Robbie, I wanted to say something about this because you made a very important point. It's a bit of a controversial point, but I want to know that during the COVID period, we got a lot of heat from people saying, why aren't you fighting against this COVID situation? And we said, we are not changing our direction. We are not focusing on COVID. We are focusing on this issue, and the issue was the public post office bank, and it was nothing else. No one else was fighting for that. No one. There was no voices fighting for a public post office bank, because at the end of the day, there were so many voices fighting for and against the measures taken in COVID that it was an absolute ruckus.
We would have been a faint echo to those voices.
And we would have had to deploy enormous resources, which we weren't prepared to do. And we had stand-up arguments with many people over this.
We lost supporters over it.
And lost supporters over it. The point is that now look at the results.
But Craig, we knew that eventually COVID would be gone.
Yes.
But the problems in Australia would not be gone, because COVID didn't bring the problems in Australia.
Look, the biggest killers in our country is not COVID. It's the economic downturn and the fact that you've got so many people now that are suffering from economic poverty, real poverty, and the social stresses on people is causing a greater degree of harm than anything that COVID will do. And it's ongoing.
Yep.
And that's the point. You have to attack this disease of neoliberalism. We have to stem the power of the banks, and this is an enormous breakthrough. I think it's the biggest one that we've had, Robbie, in terms of the history of our organisation.
Well, we didn't want to. We've gone so big on this today because we don't want to, downplay the significance of this in the Australian. What this report in the Australian, as vague as it is the first sign of a crack in the damn wall, right? So, and what happens is you quickly get used to that as the new normal. Right, and you can forget. Well, when was the first indication? This is the first indication, but we yet to see how it plays out. But I want to run through the last 4 years now, because to show you that however it plays out, we're going to ride this all the way home, because that is what we do. That is what we do. We don't take our focus off this stuff, as you indicated. Plenty of people have lobbied us to do. So here's how this came about. The Citizens Party has, like I said, for 36 years fought for a national bank, and since the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, fought to bring back a public bank. When COVID struck, there was this absolute economic chaos around the world. There were the collapse in supply chains, etc. And you can go back to our website and look at the history of this. In 2020, we put out a clarion call saying what Australia needs right now is a bank, a national bank, a development bank, that can invest in the things to make sure that we're no longer so vulnerable to the collapse of international supply chains. Everybody in the first half of 2020 was talking about that, saying, wish we hadn't got rid of all our manufacturing, etc. Right? And we went on a big blitz on that, and we even had Bob Katter wanting to introduce a bill into Parliament, and Bob Katter had introduced previous bills into Parliament for us that we wrote. But this time, for the first time ever, Bob was knocked back from introducing a bill. Anyway, then in August, 4 years ago this month, August 2020, out of the blue, as we're campaigning for a public bank, this form of a public bank, under emergency conditions of COVID, there was a Labor Party think tank here in Melbourne called Per Capita, run by Emma Dawson, and they put out a report on a post bank, right, called Filling the Void, about how a public post bank, could be the solution to Australia. We read the report, and there were 2 things we noticed about the report. One, this post bank idea was a good concept. As a model for bringing back a public bank, I saw straight away, this is actually a fantastic model, right? Because you've already got the branches there in post offices. Let's use them. The government owns them. The government can set up the bank in them. That's how you do this. And it told the story of Kiwi Bank, but it also gave the history of the Commonwealth Bank. And when I read the history, I'm thinking, this looks familiar, because it was all our work. And when I spoke to the authors, they admitted, yes, it was all our work. We are the experts on this. And I don't like to be the guy who brags, but every now and then when you get something like this, I'm going to brag, because we're the ones that have spent literally thousands of years in sorry, not years, sorry, thousands of hours
Feels like
in
years.
archives, in universities and state libraries, etc., understanding the history, looking at the original documentation. We are the experts in Australia on national banking and the Commonwealth Bank. We, the Citizens Party. Don't go any further. You want to know about it? Ask us. We've done all the work. And so they borrowed heavily from our history work. But I thought, this is fantastic. And I brought it to Bob Katter's attention. And then the next development was I got a call from Katter's office a few weeks ago saying, Robbie, Bob just had a meeting with Christine Holgate. And I said, who's Christine Holgate? And they said, she's the CEO of Australia Post. Bob talked to her about starting a postal bank and she supports it. I said, oh, that's fantastic. That's great. And so that was the end of that discussion. The next thing I knew is I'm at home on a Thursday afternoon watching Question Time in Parliament, and Scott Morrison gets up there and starts carrying on like a pork chop about Christine Holgate and said, she can go. And all the commentary was about, oh, what a terrible thing, she gave gold watches in a pandemic recession. But all I'm thinking is, hang on, I've just been told that she supports a postal bank. This guy, kicking her out of Parliament, is the biggest banker's stooge in the history of Australia. Something smells here. And we, the Citizens Party, were the only ones to ask questions about it. And that's how we met the Licensed Post Office Group, because Angela Cramp was in the media on the weekend saying Christine Holgate was the best CEO Australia Post has ever had. And I called Angela Cramp and I said, everyone else is condemning her. Everybody, literally everybody. Why are you saying that? And Angela told me the full story, including the fact that Christine was fighting for a postal bank. And then we were able to piece that together. And so from that moment, Craig, the reason I'm giving this history is because that's the moment that we developed a relentless focus on this issue. Here's the prize of postal bank. Here's what's happened. We have to tell the public. And that led to that drove our campaign around Australia Post and Christine Holgate. That led to an inquiry, which were very dramatic hearings that cleared her name. We weren't able to get her a job back. That cleared her name. From that inquiry, we segued, once that was over, we segued into a campaign about ASIC, and we used the Sterling First case in Western Australia as a case where ASIC had failed financial victims. But our motivation was, we saw that ASIC, the reason ASIC, the corporate regulator, Australian Securities Investment Commission, is such a weak regulator is because of the banks. Because the banks want to be self-regulated, they don't want to regulate it. They're the ones that demanded ASIC be a weak regulator, and we've subsequently proved that. That's why we focused on that. It was all about, here's the power of the banks that must be broken. You've got an oligopoly here that must be broken. From that, that led into the campaign around bank branch closures. And when we met Dale Webster, this incredible journalist based in Bendigo who did all this research on the true nature of the banks abandoning regional Australia and a lot of suburbs as well. And then we saw, well, hang on, if we can get this crisis that's out there in terms of regional bank services addressed, if we can bring it to the attention of everybody through an inquiry, we can then get people to see the solution is right in front of you. If the banks don't want to serve regional Australia, use the post offices as a public bank. There's the solution. That was our intention. You can testify to that. We talked about nothing but in our office all that time. We went into there with that intention. Senator Jared Rennick, who's made sure we got that inquiry up. He deserves an enormous amount of credit for this outcome. He had to step on the toes of his own coalition colleagues to get that up. Senator Rennick made that inquiry happen. He's the one who responded to this issue. As people probably know, Craig, on the weekend, Senator Rennick finally quit the Liberal Party. And he quit the Liberal Party because they wanted to get rid of him. They made sure that he's not going to contest the next election. And I was told by one of his colleagues, it's because of the banks, right? That's why Senator Rennick was...
Not because he was standing up for COVID, by the way, Robbie. I mean, because he was an outspoken person on
He gets
on
told
COVID.
that. He gets told, oh, it's because you voted against the government on vaccines. A lot of Liberals have criticised the government on vaccines. That's not what distinguished him. What distinguished him as a Liberal that no other Liberals did was this question of wanting a public bank back. And when the first time I met Senator Rennick in 2019 when I was meeting members of Parliament that year. And I have to thank, sometimes people can see him, but Ben Pearce, who's our producer of our show, sitting over there in the back, I was in Canberra. This was when the bushfires were on and it was all smoky, and I got a call from Ben saying, Robbie, someone I've just been speaking to said you should meet Senator Rennick, and he's organised a meeting, etc. So Ben made that happen. I went and met Senator Rennick. And the very first thing Gerard Rennick said to me, he said, because he's a brand new senator, he said, my main goal as a senator is to get a government bank. He called it a government infrastructure bank. That was his goal, right? And even though he's going to contest the next election, and God, I hope he wins and gets back in there. But even if he doesn't, he may have actually achieved his goal. And hats off to Gerard Rennick for that. But we had this incredible inquiry into bank branch closures. Every hearing confirmed that this was the solution. The other person I want to credit at the moment, Craig, is Senator Malcolm Roberts. Malcolm Roberts came to the very first hearing of this inquiry in Sale in Victoria, and he had two ideas in his head. One was, we need a postal bank, and he asked everybody in that hearing about a postal bank. And the other one was Craig Isherwood's article on the Commonwealth Bank. And he had your article, and he's telling everyone, read Craig Isherwood's article on the Commonwealth Bank. They were the two ideas in his head. And so he was not a member of the committee, but he was a participant in that inquiry. And Senator Roberts, Malcolm Roberts, made sure he did everything he could to shape this discussion around a postal bank. And that's what ended up in the recommendations.
Well, I was just going to jump in there, Rob, because the point is Senator Matt Canavan, who was the chair of that committee, I mean, I think he fundamentally was changed by this committee, because he actually saw what was happening in the community relating to these bank branch closures. It was
undeniable. He couldn't deny it.
And he said this was the most important, most successful committee that he's ever been on as a senator. Now, I met Matt Canavan when he first came into the Senate, years ago. I don't know how long ago.
At least 10 years ago.
And I can say he was pretty rabid neoliberal back then.
Yeah, he came straight out of the Productivity Commission.
And over the years, he's started to become this guy that now, he chaired the committee, and the second recommendation of the committee was for an expert panel to be set up for a public post office bank.
Yep.
Now, that's not a neoliberal, and he would have had to fight Anna Bligh, he would have to fight the Liberals on this.
Yep.
But the point is that he saw that he has to act in the face of the misery that he saw in all these different hearings which you went to, that we funded you to go to. Some of those are out in the middle of whoop whoop, like Tom Price.
That was a lot of work last year.
There was a lot of work and a lot of travel, and I don't blame you for not wanting to travel now. But the point is that Matt Canavan should be congratulated too for running such an incredibly important and successful.
Because that's what's
committee.
This reporter for the Australian, Bridget Clark. That's what she has acknowledged, that it was the driver for the government being forced to look at this was that, and that's what we had strategized to make it turn it into, right? And I was able to testify with Glenn Isherwood at the main December hearing of this inquiry, one of 13, but we just testified that if you want the most successful way to stop branch closures has already been proved, because we know a public post office bank will stop the big four Australian banks from closing branches because it had already happened, just not in Australia. But our big four own the big four banks in New Zealand, and when Kiwi Bank was set up by the government in New Zealand in circumstances that were sort of similarly dramatic, as we've described, and I interviewed Matt Robson for the Citizens Insight show, he was one of the ministers in the New Zealand government that set up Kiwi Bank, so he tells a story on this in 2022. The first thing the banks did is stop closing branches. There were no branch closures in New Zealand for 7 years after Kiwi Bank started. That's how you stop banks closing branches. You make them compete with a public bank. People are probably familiar with all the arguments, right? You cannot argue against their arguments. They are undeniable. We have all the facts. It was just about winning the political battle. The political battle over who is the government more concerned about pleasing, the banking lobby, Anna Bligh and the banks, or the Australian people if they want to get re-elected. And it looks like that is coming down in our favour. And now what we have to do, Craig, is find out more about this, and trust me, I've been on the phone all morning. I'm talking to everyone I can. So I'm trying to get as much information on this as I can. By the way, this is Thursday. There's hearings today and tomorrow of the House Economics Committee. This is the annual hearings where the banks have to come to the hearings. So it'll be interesting if this comes up in those hearings and how the banks respond to that. But now it's about, it looks like we've won the argument, an intense 4-year battle to win the argument. So it looks like we've won the argument. Now we have to stay on the job though to shape the outcome, to make sure this bank can be the best it can be. Because it could be anything. It could be a weak, boutique little lender, right? Or it could be a powerful public bank that revolutionises the Australian economy, invests in a renaissance of industry and development across regional Australia, and all of Australia. But the reason I say regional Australia, which is in everyone's interest, is because this bank could be a big infrastructure funder if the government wanted it to be, all those sort of things, so that people don't have to cram into the major capital cities. You can spread out around the country. We can bring towns back to life. All it requires is investment. And the problem with since we've privatised the Commonwealth Bank is this. There's been no public bank to provide that investment. All investment has come from the private banks, and all they're interested in is maximising their profits. And therefore, they've only focused on the property markets in the major cities. And the rest of Australia has suffered, right? This could reverse all of that. That's the power. Now, it also solves the problem, Craig, and I'm giddy with excitement for people to see this. It also solves the problem of saving the postal network, because as we've been putting a lot of emphasis on that recently, the postal network's in serious trouble. This will create the revenue for that. And so our friends at the Licensed Post Office Group, they had an AGM last weekend in Tasmania, and then they went back to their respective towns from their AGM, and they have produced this video about the benefits of a post office bank. Roll it.
Hi. Thanks very much. At LPA Group, we know that local communities thrive when they're connected. That's why we're advocating for creating an Australian postal bank. By adding full-service banking to our post offices, we'll ensure essential banking services are available in over 4,200 communities across Australia. What do you think of the Northern Territory, Terry?
Thanks, Scott. With this postal bank, we're not just bringing back banking, we're generating the funding needed to keep the Australia Post Community Post Office network strong and viable. What do Queenslanders think, Emmerich?
Our community needs reliable, accessible services. A local bank branch means more than transactions. It means local businesses thrive, families are supported, and connections stay strong. Let's hear from South Australia, did we?
For 4,200 towns and suburbs, this will provide stability and a foundation for the future. It's about keeping these communities alive and vibrant for the long term. What about in Tasmania, Kelly?
An Australian postal bank isn't just an idea, it's a solution to strengthen communities, reconnect banking services, and safeguard the future of the community post office network.
Together, we can build stronger, more connected communities, starting with the Australian Postal Bank.
Now, it speaks for itself.
It does.
Look, if you're a regular viewer of this show, now that you've seen that video, just think about how you're responding to it, and just imagine now every politician in Parliament gets to see that in the coming weeks, because we have to make that happen. We have to make that happen. So one of the things we're going to do, that's where we rely on you. And I'm about to ask you something, and when you hear me ask you, listen to it in the context of what we've just said, because every time we've asked you, the viewer, to activate, and you've done something that we've asked you to do, that is what has contributed to this outcome. When I've said this is a Citizens Party victory, that includes you guys, right? We are nothing without the willingness of our supporters and members, etc., to actually do the things that we ask them to do. So in this case, it is a priority, and you have the copy that's on this video. We might provide some links below to a more direct copy. We'll come up with TikTok versions and all kinds of stuff to share this. You must get this to your local member of parliament and your senators, and it's only 90 seconds. Demand they watch it. Just say, you've got to watch this. Make sure someone in their office watches it. Harass them until they've come back to you and said, yes, we've watched it. Right? They get to get this, because this is going to be a really important part of shaping what a postal bank looks like going forward. All right, now, Craig, we better move on slightly, because we've got a less positive thing to talk about in relation to the banks.
Well, stay tuned for next week's developments.
That's right. But I have to run through this quickly because we're running out of time. Because what we were going to cover today, which we haven't touched yet, is the fact that the issue of reforming the Reserve Bank is back on the agenda. Last Thursday, after our show is recorded, Jim Chalmers gave a press conference where he revealed he's written to Angus Taylor and to try and do a deal to get the Reserve Bank Reforms Bill through. Now, they haven't talked about this bill for 6 months, since February, when there was a Senate hearing into the bill, and everybody just excoriated, literally everybody, except for the people who did the Reserve Bank Reform Review, everybody, including Peter Costello, Australia's longest serving treasurer, just excoriated the idea of the reforms to the suggested reforms that included repealing Section 11 of the RBA Act. And of course, Section 11 is the section that gives the Treasurer a veto over the monetary policy decisions, meaning interest rate changes, made by the Reserve Bank.
Which means the elected government has got the democratically elected government, for what that's worth, has the power to direct an unelected body on how monetary policy is run in this country.
That's what Section 11 provides, and it's never been used. It's been talked over the 79 years since it was originally legislated in 49, and 65 years since 1959 when the RBA Act started and it was re-included in there. It's never been used, ever.
There's been a few threats. I think Keating used it as a threat.
Keating, Fraser, and LBJ.
Okay.
So I keep calling him
LBJ.
Harold Holt. When I think of Harold Holt, I think of all the way with LBJ, and so I call him LBJ. Oh, Harold Holt, when he was treasurer under Menzies, threatened to use it.
Well, the point is,
3 times.
Because it's there, it operates as something that the Reserve Bank in its decisions had to say, well, hang on a sec, if we do this, is it going to cause this problem under Section 11? So it's a check.
And that's a healthy thing for the Reserve Bank to have to think through, right? And they know that a government will only use it under extreme circumstances, because the way it works is, if the government and the Reserve Bank governor disagree, if the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank governor disagree over an interest rate decision, and the Treasurer disagrees enough, the Treasurer can say to the Reserve Bank governor, no, I disagree with that. And the Reserve Bank governor says, well, put it in writing. So the Treasurer has to put it in writing. They first have to talk about it. If they can't come to an agreement, this is why it was put in there by Curtin and Chifley, then of those two, whose will should prevail? The unelected person or the elected person? It is literally about democracy and sovereignty. And so since 1945, the principle in Australia is no, the elected authority must prevail ultimately over the financial system. And so then what the Treasurer has to do is put in writing his objection, table that in Parliament, and then as Treasurer, his will prevails. And he gets to say to the Reserve Bank, this is what you're going to do. So it's a very transparent process, and the Treasurer must have good arguments for what he's doing, right? That's what it's there for. This is not something that just allows willy-nilly interference. But what's happened is the Bank for International Settlements, which is the king of the globalists, all globalisation emanates out of the Bank for International Settlements. Because like I said before, it starts with the financial power, the money power, controls everything else. The Bank for International Settlements has been dictating for decades now, but especially since the global financial crisis, any government interference in central banks and regulators must be got rid of. But what they call government interference, they call it interference. We call accountability. democratic accountability. Because if the government has no say, then the democratic authority is lesser to the unelected authority. And John Curtin said it best. 1937, John Curtin gave a speech, Australia's greatest Prime Minister by a country mile. He said, if the government of the day deliberately excludes itself from participating in the making of monetary policy, it cannot govern except in a secondary degree, meaning someone else is in charge, i.e. the unelected bankers, right? That's the principle we're fighting for here. So what Jim Chalmers, so that hearing totally obliterated the government's arguments, and the government went quiet. They've said nothing until last Thursday. And out of the blue, Jim Chalmers says he's written to Angus Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer, because they want to sew this up as a tidy deal between the two major parties, the parties of government they call themselves. And he said to the Shadow Treasurer, okay, we won't repeal Section 11, but we want to add something to it to make sure it's only used in the most extreme circumstances.
I call that, Robbie, before you give the punchline, the trust me clause. The trust me clause. Now, whenever people hear a political party or person saying, trust me, I know that people run a mile, because this is what this is.
It is.
So trust me.
And so what they're going to do is they're going to add a public interest test.
Great. Yeah, trust me. We're going to have public interest. Oh, yeah?
So it's already just...
If it was a public interest, we'd already have a postal bank.
It's already, think about this, it's already hard to use. They want to make it harder. What do they mean by public interest? Well, we've got some examples for you. How does this government look at the public interest? Well, there's an Australian hero rotting in jail right now and going through a very difficult time, and he's an absolute hero. And he's sat right where you are, and his name's David McBride. And we know about whistleblowing, we know about war crimes in Afghanistan because of that man. There's something like 36 or whatever, I think it is, Afghan families have been compensated by the Australian government for their family members being killed, murdered by Australian soldiers because of that man. And he's rotting in jail because this government refused to accept that when you any blowing of a whistle, Craig, involves breaking some minor laws. This government refused to accept that there's a public interest in doing that. Because if the government has a power in the case of whistleblowers to say that act was in the public interest, therefore there won't be any charges. They refused to accept that. They prosecuted him and he's in jail. So he's in jail. There's another Australian hero who blew the whistle on real wrongdoing by the Australian Tax Office, literally persecuting businesses. His name's Richard Boyle. He's going to jail because this government refuses to accept there was a public interest in that. So if those two cases of whistleblowers revealing real wrongdoing that has led to changes in relation to those subjects, they've both led to changes. If they don't meet, if the government won't see that as a public interest, it's never going to intervene over the RBA on interest rates.
That's why I say it's a trust me clause, Robbie.
Yeah.
It means nothing.
And we've described this as a padlock. What Jim Chalmers is proposing to do is put a padlock on the power so it's never used, right? We cannot let that happen. And so look at the link below. We put out a release about this today with marching orders. We need for when you watch this show, next week is a non-sitting week and then Parliament's back. We need to just hammer. And I mean hammer Angus Taylor, the recipient of the letter, the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, and say, you must not do that deal with Jim Chalmers. You must not accept him putting a padlock on that power. Right?
That's the trust me. It sounds so necessary, so important, or so innocuous, right? But just trust us. It'll be no problem at all. What they've done is they chuck a padlock on the entire section.
And then let's finish with this, because you're looking at this and you go, okay, this is a political loss for you, but you're clinging to it. Jim Chalmers is desperate to stop this power ever being used. It's never been used. And you know it's coming from the Bank for International Settlements. So then that raises a question, Craig. What are they planning?
Yeah, well...
Because the whole purpose of this, it's like with bail-in. Bail-in also came out of the Bank for International Settlements. And it's one of the reasons they demanded this, getting government interference out, because when the Bank for International Settlements wants to create the circumstance, when they order a bail-in, which means a bank that's going under can be rescued by stealing all the deposits of the customers to rescue that bank. No elected government that wants to get re-elected is going to be game to do that, because you steal all the deposits of a major bank's customers, right? They're not going to vote for you ever. So
voting with the least thing that's on their mind, Robbie. I'm afraid.
Exactly. And that's the bail-in scenario. The global financial system is going back to being really, really wobbly. The American economy is just collapsing under the biggest public debt in the history of the universe. What is this apparatus planning? That's why there's an urgency to this. All right, so what you can do is click on the link below, read that release with the details in it, get onto your local Member of Parliament, especially if it's a Liberal or a National, and get onto Angus Taylor's office. Those 2 calls you got to make, and just hammer Angus Taylor. You must not do this. You must not do this deal with the Treasurer. And then one more thing about this section, we'll do a follow-up on this, but just quickly, there's another part of the RBA Act they want to repeal, which is Section 36. Sorry, this is a different act, the Australian Banking Act. But it's Section 36 of that act, which is a power for the RBA. The RBA, under that power, can direct the banks how and where to lend. Not who to lend to, just how, where and how much, right? So they say, stop lending into housing, lend into small business. The RBA has that power. They can say to the banks, you're creating a problem in this area that's going to have consequences, stop doing it. That's the power they have at the moment. They're proposing to repeal that power. But what they're not proposing to repeal is the fact that the RBA is what's called the lender of last resort. And as the lender of last resort, that means its job is to bail out the private banks if they ever get into trouble. It's expected to bail them out. By removing this power, Section 36, the RBA will be expected to bail out banks, but it will not be able to direct those banks to stop doing the things that it's going to need to bail them out for. How is that sane? Right? And again, this is a power that's been in there for a long time. So every part of this RBA reform is garbage, starting with Section 11, but that Section 36 is also quite important. All right, let's move on, Craig. We're running out of time. Yep. Foreign agents in Parliament pushing Australia towards total destruction. Now, just quickly, we have, what I'm about to go through is in the latest issue of the Australian Alert Service that you can see here. We have a video, another video I want to show, or a couple of videos actually, because this is breaking news. But this is emblematic of the fact that Australia. Our whole argument here is Australia doesn't have sovereignty. When it comes to foreign policy, Australia has zero sovereignty. So the scandal that's broken overnight is Anthony Albanese has been at the Pacific Islands Forum, which Australia is part of, and New Zealand with the Pacific Islands. America is not part of the Pacific Islands Forum. China is not part of the Pacific Islands Forum, even though they're both Pacific countries, but they're in attendance as observers. Australia got yesterday the Pacific Islands Forum to agree to this regional security arrangement, right, where people might have seen on the news. Local police from the Pacific Islands will be trained in Brisbane, etc., $400 million price tag. Then this video has leaked, or been published actually, by a New Zealand journalist, of Anthony Albanese having achieved that agreement, reporting back to an American who was present, Kurt Campbell, that essentially Australia has achieved something that America wanted.
We're making our way through the Pacific, just to
Well,
tour.
we had a cracker today, getting the Pacific Policing Initiative.
This
through
is fantastic that you did
It's
this.
so important. Like, it'll make such a difference.
It's just great that you did it. And I talked with Kevin about it, and so, we were going to do something, and he asked us not to, so we did not. We've given you the lane. So
Very good.
take the lane.
Oh, well, you can go as Harvey's on the cost if you like. And it cost you a bit.
Oh,
Yeah.
come on, Lydia.
So let me just be clear on what that is, right? He's saying to Kurt Campbell, and I'll tell you more about Kurt Campbell in a minute, that we've got this outcome. He said, what a cracker of a thing. Kurt Campbell says, yeah, well, as you know, we wanted that, but Kevin Rudd told me, let us take the lead on it. So he said, we give you your lane. The great Americans have said, oh yeah, okay, Aussies do this for us. So good, we've done it. And so proving that it's what America wanted, Albo then, in a bit of a Weasley way, drops this hint, oh, you want to pay for half of it, right? $400 million, right? How pathetic are we? Seriously, how pathetic are we? Now, Kurt Campbell is the number one string puller in the world from the United States of the conflict with China. That guy. Because there was no conflict with China before 2011. In 2011, the Obama administration, having literally presided over the last stage of the total destruction of Iraq, and then doubled down and repeated that crime in Libya, and then tried to start the same crime in Syria, right? And realizing the whole Middle East is just an utter mess, Middle East and North Africa. The Americans had literally turned the Middle East and North Africa into a hellscape. Not the Russians, not the Chinese, the Americans and their allies had done that, right? Kurt Campbell then, for the Obama administration, came up with this idea of what was called the Asia pivot. That strategically, America would pivot to the Asia Pacific to confront China. And if you wonder why China might have been worried about that, just look again at what they did to the North Africa and the Middle East. This is Malcolm Fraser called them dangerous allies. This is a dangerous country. They talked themselves into mass murder in the name of we've been threatened, so we're going to do this. We have the right to do this. So the Chinese are like, well, hang on, what are you doing? 60% of America's military firepower was transferred under that guy's idea, Kurt Campbell's idea. Soon afterwards, by the way, Craig, he went and set up a consultancy that he's a principal of, called the Asia Group, whose job is to do deals for private defence contractors to get government contracts that have flowed from the increase in military spending from countries like Australia because of that deal, because of the Asia pivot. So not only is he a mastermind of warmongering, he's a goddamn corrupt bastard as well to cash in on it. Give me more. I want to make money out of this game, right? That's who that is. And our Prime Minister is literally sucking up to him in public. Well, he's now embarrassed that's come out. Because that New Zealand journalist, they just assumed she was taking photos. So roll this tape. This is him at a press conference the next day trying to downplay this big time because he knows what it looks like. Roll the tape.
Mr Albanese was caught on a hot mic, a recording that was made by a New Zealand journalist joking with Kurt Campbell, the US Deputy Secretary of State, about, quote, going halvesies on the entire initiative. In other words, splitting the cost. He also heard from Kurt Campbell that the US was pursuing a similar initiative before Kevin Rudd, the Australian ambassador in Washington, dissuaded the administration from doing so. Mr Albanese was pressed about what the details of that US plan was. He responded quite forcefully by saying that it was unethical for the journalists to record him in this way, and saying that the two men were simply having a joke.
No. The video is what it is. Someone, it's up to them to, whoever did that, to think about their own ethics when it comes to journalism. It was a private conversation. It was a jovial conversation, a friendly one. It is what it is. People try and read something into it. You must be pretty bored, frankly.
It was on the plenary floor. It was open to media.
Oh, you must be pretty bored. Journalists tend to identify themselves professionals. I hope that you do.
Now, so he's clearly in damage control, right? But that's what they do, people behind closed doors when they think we're not watching.
Yep.
They are literally scheming like that. We are just their deputy sheriff. And I want to read you a quote from the Australian today because Matthew Knott, who's notorious as the journalist that Paul Keating said, you should be ashamed of yourself, you should drum yourself out of journalism. This was in March last year, 2023, Paul Keating said to him at the National Press Club. Even Matthew Knott wrote this in the Australian today. Beijing regularly portrays Australia as little more than a proxy for US interests in the region, accusing it of behaving as America's deputy sheriff and seeking to drag Pacific nations into a Cold War-style superpower conflict. And it was on display there. And the thing is, the countries that we're trying to suck up to, these Pacific Island nations, they have been doing deals with China. And the Solomon Islands Prime Minister explained why. And he said it in an open letter last year. He said, the reason we've done this deal with China is because Australia offers us, we'll do your policing for you because we want to have a presence here in the Pacific. And your part of it is you can send your workers to Australia to be cheap labour so they can send their money back to Solomon Islands for their families. How's that deal? China goes to these countries and says, well, we've developed by building infrastructure. We're helping Africa develop by building infrastructure. What infrastructure would you like that's going to help your country develop? So, for instance, your forests, instead of just other countries making money out of them, you can make money out of them, etc. And that's what these countries want, and that's why they do their deals, and that's what we're trying to demonise. And if it was one thing, if we were doing it on behalf of our own interest, but we're not. We're doing it on behalf of the Americans. We have no sovereignty. And so the other thing that happened last week, just as obnoxiously, was, and there was an act of foreign interference in our parliament, and you got to hear it to believe it. This was as blatant as it gets. China, I'm talking about China now. So I've been bagging America, so now we're going to shift to China, right? I'm nothing if not even-handed. Some regular viewers will be jaws will be dropping listening to me say this. China funded Australian senators to travel to China, where they hatched a plan with China to get a motion through the Australian Senate supporting China. And back in Australia, the Senate last week successfully moved and passed that motion in the Senate supporting China's position on the international stage. And the motion wasn't just that, it was against Australian policy, established Australian policy. Now, there's been a lot of concerns about foreign interference over the last few years. So this is a stunning example of it. What's going to be done about it? Nothing. Why? Because the China in question is the Republic of China, which is otherwise known as Taiwan, but its official name is the Republic of China. It's not the People's Republic of China, which is mainland China, run from Beijing. The Republic of China, the Taiwan government, the Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, paid for the flights and accommodation of Labor Senator Deb O'Neill and Liberal Senator David Fawcett. They travelled to Taipei for the 28th and 30th of July, a month ago, along with pairs of legislators from 24 other countries. There they resolved to return to their respective countries and pass motions in their parliaments which are against the United Nations resolution that admitted the People's Republic of China to the UN in 1971 in place of Taiwan dictator Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China. And this is what the motion that so this was bought and paid for by the Taiwanese government, essentially, this motion, right? This was the motion that passed the Senate. I'll get the text put on the screen so you can read along. That, in the opinion of the Senate, the following is a matter of urgency. They don't explain why it's a matter of urgency. That United Nations Resolution 2758 of the 25th of October 1971 does not establish the People's Republic of China's sovereignty over Taiwan and does not determine the future status of Taiwan in the United Nations, nor Taiwanese participation in UN agencies or international organisations. Now, you're probably already bored. That might seem a bit innocuous, but it's actually potentially tectonic. So I want to read you now the actual UN resolution that they're saying from 1971, what that resolution says, and I'll get this put on the screen as well. So bear in mind they're saying that this resolution does not establish Chinese sovereignty or the PRC's sovereignty over Taiwan and doesn't determine the future status of Taiwan. The General Assembly, recalling the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, considering the restoration of the lawful rights of the People's Republic of China is essential both for the protection of the Charter of the UN and for the cause that the UN must serve under the Charter. Recognising that the representatives of the government of the PRC are the only lawful representatives of China to the UN, and that the People's Republic of China is one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, decides to restore all its rights to the People's Republic of China and to recognise the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the UN, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and in all the organisations related to it. Now, so on the one hand, that's clear that this resolution is absolutely clear. The only lawful representation at the UN is from the People's Republic of China. This is clear. But I want to read you a quote now from John Lander, who's the former Deputy Ambassador to China. He's sat where you are many times. I've interviewed John. He helped to negotiate through DFAT this kind of stuff back in the 70s. So his quote is, "The assertion in the Senate motion is factually correct, but mischievous in implying that this was the purpose of the UN resolution. The actual purpose of the UN resolution was to accept the reality that Taiwan had been legally restored to China's sovereignty by Japan's instrument of surrender in 1945, brackets, before the advent of the PRC, the Communist Party hadn't won the Civil War then, and that the PRC had subsequently become the legitimate government of the whole of China." So what he's saying is actually Australia, and his point is Australia recognised it as well. In 1945, Australia and the rest of the world acknowledged that thanks to Japan's surrender, Taiwan was back under Chinese sovereignty. It was all part of the one China, and there was only one Chinese government to speak of, right? That was in 45. That was in the middle of a civil war, actually. Civil war ended in 49 when the communists took control of mainland China. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, right? And the civil war was interrupted. And it's never been resolved. It's an uninterrupted civil war. It has never been resolved. And all that happened in 1971 and 1972 is that countries like Australia didn't change anything about the status of Taiwan. They didn't change their acknowledgement there's only one China. What they did is they switched their recognition of the sovereignty over that one China from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. Now, we have a link. We'll put a link below to this article where you can read it, because we don't have time now, but there's a bunch of questions there that we've asked the Australian government. But why is this so important? I want to quote someone. In 2013, Australia honoured Singapore's former Foreign Minister George Yeo as a honorary officer of the Order of Australia, because they said this guy is our friend. So we gave him this honour. So he's a leading expert on China, Singapore's former Foreign Minister, and because he's a friend of Australia, we should heed his advice. On the 19th of June 2021, in a podcast with Kishore Mahbubani, Singapore's former ambassador to the UN, George Yeo said China's decision to establish relations with the United States and Australia, etc., back in 1971 and 72, was based entirely on our countries accepting there was one China. And then this is the quote. He said, "So that is bedrock," Yeo said. "It is not a card. If you play the bedrock as if it is a card, then the structure upon which an edifice is built can rapidly collapse. So from China's perspective, there must be no ambiguity. They have made it very clear that even if it means war, so be it." End quote. That's how high the stakes are, Craig. China has said the red line of Taiwan is its one and only red line. And these senators, what they were trying to do last week is actually lay the foundation for Taiwan being treated as a separate independent country. Knowing from people like George Yeo that that's actually a recipe for war. That's what happened in the Parliament last week. And the worst part, this idiot president of China, this idiot president of Taiwan, who funded all this, he's pro-independence. But his parliament's not. He couldn't get an independence vote through the parliament, and he'd have to pass a referendum to amend the constitution, and he wouldn't get that passed either. Because most people in Taiwan are not pro-independence. They know it means war, right? So what are we doing? What are we doing? Click on the link below and you can look at that article. Anyway, so we're running out of time, Craig.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Enjoy the victory, people, but stay tuned. We'll keep you updated how this plays out. Make sure you make those calls. Let's ride this all the way to the end and hammer Angus Taylor. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.